Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101, where we're continuing to travel through a commentary produced by Ligonier Ministries from RC Sproul, who is not doing much of an expository exposition of Romans 9, as we've already pointed out in the first 3 episodes. And obviously I'm long-winded, so we take a long time to go through these things. But I am trying to, as I've said before, to represent Calvinism with their best proponents of the view. In other words, I want to try to find the most influential, most respected kinds of Calvinists in order to have them represent themselves. What better way to allow a Calvinist to represent himself, but to let him speak for himself, to look at their commentaries for themselves. And so I encourage you to do the same, show the same kind of respect for somebody, even though you don't agree with them, to look at their own words, try to understand where they're coming from. Don't straw man them, but try to truly see where they're coming from when you're answering their particular perspective. As is scrolling on the bottom of your screen, just a reminder, go to Soteriology101.com, click on that class link to learn more about Trinity Seminary, where you can get a higher theological education. You can also click on that support link in the top right corner of the screen if you'd like to become a one-time giver or a monthly patron of the program. We could not do this without our monthly patrons. We appreciate so much the support we get to help spread the news of God's love and provision for all people. So with that said, let's dive right in here. We left off in verse 17 of the exposition from RC Sproul. And he of course starts by presenting the text. And so let's read through that together. And I'm going to try to do better this time. And when I listen back to some of the audio, it's tough to tell whenever I'm reading from RC Sproul and when I'm just giving commentary, because when audio doesn't really indicate that like a video would. And so I'm going to do my best to try to indicate when I'm reading from RC Sproul versus whenever I'm commenting about what RC Sproul is saying. And so bear with me there. The scriptures say, "For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name might be declared in all of the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. You may say then to me, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this?" Now, before we jump into the commentary, which starts with the words John Calvin, by the way, it's one of the reasons I use that clip art here in the beginning, is to show the immediate thing that the lenses through which Sproul is obviously reading this text is through the lens of Calvinism, through the lens of the concept of compatibilistic theistic determinism, the idea that God ultimately is the one who decides what you'll decide with regard to salvation. And so he's about to quote from Calvin and talk about John Calvin here. But before he does that, because we're doing this in breakout bits, and there's not there's not the time to go back over all that we've already gone over, I would encourage you to listen to the previous episodes, because we've already talked about where this interlocutor is coming from in the previous episode. This is the same interlocutor we see, our objector in the mind of Paul, that we're seeing in Romans chapter 3. It's the Jewish objector who is saying, why would you find fault with us, the hardened Israelite that you have cut off in our rebellion, not cut off arbitrarily before we're born, but cut off in our rebellion. You have cut off us in our rebellion, and you're using us in our rebellion to bring about your purpose and plan. So why are we to blame? If our unrighteousness highlights your righteousness, then why are we to blame? It'd be like Pharaoh, if he were still living, saying, well, God, if my hardened rebellion by refusing to let the people go through those plagues actually demonstrated your power over the false gods of Egypt, then why am I to be blamed? Because after all, my hardened rebellion was being used to serve your purpose. So why am I to be blamed? That's exactly the same interlocutor in the mind of Paul, the Jewish interlocutor, who is just like Pharaoh, was hardened to bring about the first Passover. They are now being, generally speaking, the nation of Israel is being hardened, cut off in their rebellion, so as to bring about the second Passover. And that rebellious, hardened Jew being used by God to bring about his purposes of redemption would be saying, well, why are you to blame us if this is a part of your plan of redemption, to harden and blind us in our rebellion? That's the interlocutor. And I go in more detail earlier. And so I don't know how to be more clear about that than what we've already been through, but I don't want to have to repeat it all either for time's sake. So here's what R.C. Sproul writes. John Calvin said that the doctrine of election is one of the most difficult doctrines of sacred scripture and must be handled with care. Now, let me just stop there and just say this. Is it really that difficult if you understand it the way the provisionist explains it? No, it's really basically simple. It's not complex. It's only, I think the complexity is created by the esoteric baggage added into the text in the 5th century by Augustine when he reads determinism into things. Election is not a complex doctrine. It just means choice. And as we've pointed out, God makes many choices in his plan for redemption. He makes a choice of the nation of Israel, not to the neglect of the other nations, as we pointed out. He chooses the nation of Israel to be a blessing to the other nations of the world. That's a doctrine of election from the scriptures. God doesn't choose people to the neglect of other people. He chooses people to bring a blessing to other people. He chooses prophets. He chooses apostles. Again, these people aren't chosen to the neglect of other individuals. They're individuals chosen for the blessing, to bring a blessing to other individuals, okay? And so God chooses a nation. He chooses individuals from that nation to do what? To just effectually save some of them and not others? No. He chooses them to be the mouthpiece through which the blessings would come, the mouthpiece through which the law, the prophets, the oracles, all of the things of God would come through this nation to be a blessing to all the other nations of the world. Okay, that is a biblical doctrine of election. And then you get to God's choice to take the message first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. And then you got the message, the election of God to grant entrance to those who come clothed in the righteousness of Christ, those who come clothed in faith. Now, he takes the message to the highways and the byways, to the good and the bad alike. He doesn't have to take it to everybody, but he chooses in his gracious goodness to take it both to Jews and to Gentiles. And he grants entrance to whom? To those who are only good? No. Remember, the message went to the good and the bad alike. But who does he grant entrance to? Those who have come clothed in the righteousness of Christ through faith. So it's faith is the condition for the entrance into the kingdom. Though many are called, few are elect. Who are the elect ones? People just unilaterally picked for no apparent reason before they're ever born? No. Who are the elect ones? Those who came in response to the invitation, clothed in the righteousness of Christ, the right wedding garments. It's very, very simple when you understand it from that perspective. It's only when you add determinism, i.e., God determines not only his choices, but yours too, that this becomes esoteric and weird and strange and has all this kinds of two wills of God and two different kinds of love and two different kinds of calling and two different kinds of everything, so that you have a category to drop everything in, because it's the only way you can unfalsify the view. And that's what we're trying to make this more basic and simple understanding, that even a fisherman from the 1st century with a 3rd grade education could understand this, because it's basic and it's simple. God loves you. He's provided a means of atonement. He's provided a means of salvation for anybody and everybody. Trust in him with a simple childlike faith, and he will save you. It's really, really simple. It's really basic. He goes on to write, he says, you have to handle this with care, caution, tenderness, patience among those who struggle with it. And again, I appreciate the sentiment which he's talking here, obviously, that you need to be careful with difficult, hard teachings. And there are some difficulties, obviously, within the scriptures and some difficult things. I just don't think it has to be as difficult as some people try to make it to be. And obviously, you only want to be difficult. You don't want to create difficulty with man-made doctrines and philosophies. And I think that's what some of what Calvinism has done to the text. They have made things a lot more complex than they need to be. But it should not be, he goes on to write, but it should not be neglected. And that's where we would agree, by the way. I agree with John Calvin. You should not neglect the doctrine of predestination or the doctrine of election. Some people try to toss the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and say, well, we don't believe Calvinism, therefore we don't believe the doctrine of election. Well, that's just a word out of ignorance. That's not what we should be saying. So people who are saying, I don't believe in that predestination, I don't believe in that election, they have not studied the scriptures, because it's not that we reject the doctrine of predestination or the doctrine of election. It's that we reject specifically the Calvinistic or theistic deterministic way of looking at predestination and election. We do believe the doctrine of election, as we just explained it. We do believe in the doctrine of predestination as properly understood within the context of the scriptures, not the way the Calvinist has changed it to be over the years, first introduced by really Augustine in the 4th and 5th century. He goes on to write, the doctrine comes from the word of God. And even though we struggle with it, we must not sweep it under the rug. We must deal with it, albeit carefully. I have participated in numerous, this is Sproul writing, obviously, I've participated in numerous call-in radio programs. And I know before the phones start ringing what is going to be at the top of the list. Well, if he knows it, that means he predetermined it, right? Sorry, couldn't help myself. If you know something's going to happen, you must predetermine it, because that's the only way you could possibly know it, right? He goes on to write, predestination and election. Every time somebody asks me about that in a radio call-in context, I would prefer not to answer. I would rather say nothing than to say too little. I just cannot deal with this subject in a 2-minute radio response, because a short response generates more questions than it answers. And I appreciate the sentiment of that. He's getting to a good reason for being long-winded when it comes to these things. It takes time to unpack very difficult, esoteric, philosophical baggage. It takes time to do that. It's one of the reasons I tend to be a little bit long-winded when I'm talking on this topic. It takes a while to explain and to get to it. What are the key distinctions between, Peter's asking, what are the key distinctions between provisionism and Arminianism? I do get into that in several other broadcasts. If you'll just search for the word Arminian at Soteriology 101, you'll see a lot of that. There's a lot of commonalities between the two of us, but there are some distinctions, and there are distinctions within the different kinds of Arminians as well, because there's different kinds of Arminians. There's some Arminians that agree with me on some aspects of my provisionistic view of theology. So moving on, though, I'm just trying to stick to the context here, because if I don't, then it'll really take a long time. He gets into double predestination. So here is a Calvinist teaching on the doctrine of double predestination. So here's what he says. I'm frequently asked whether I believe in double predestination. Here's what we face when I have to call double or nothing. If some of humanity is elect, then others are non-elect. The non-elect are those whom we call the reprobate. Now, I want you to notice that there is no mention of these people in the Bible. There is not a mention of these people in the Bible. Now, there's mention of people who refuse to believe and suppress the truth and unrighteousness, who are rebels. Yes, rebel sinners who have refused to believe in God. Yes, but there's no mention of these so-called reprobates, people unilaterally picked for destruction before they ever were born. There is no mention of this. This is a false reading of people like Esau, who was not chosen to carry the promise, and a misreading of that to say Esau is representative of reprobates, non-elect people who are doomed for destruction before they're born. Okay, this category of people does not exist in the scriptures, as far as I can tell, and that's I think part of the mistake of Calvinism. So, as far as I'm concerned, Sproul writes, unless we are universalist, there is no way to avoid the idea of double aspect to divine predestination. And he's right. If you're going to be a Calvinist, you have to believe not only in the belief that there are elect unto salvation, but you have to also believe, therefore, there must be the non-elect, those who are ultimately created for damnation. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. Some Calvinists want to try to so emphasize the election to the positive side of salvation that they won't even bring up the reprobate or the non-elect of the other side of the same coin. And I can understand why they don't want to talk about those people, because it is intuitively unjust to judge people for something they're born without any control over it. They have no control over their being reprobate, and yet they're judged for their reprobation. And that's why a lot of Calvinists don't like to talk about the other side of the coin. They only want to talk about the positive aspects and be thankful for what God has done and being chosen and all these kinds of things. But when you just flip the page and you say, okay, well, what about the reprobate? Let's talk about their blameworthiness. Let's talk about why they're blameworthy and God's not on their particular view of reprobation. How do you manage to call them guilty for sins when they were apparently, according to at least a consistent hermeneutic of Romans chapter 9, they were reprobated prior to doing anything good or bad? How do you reconcile that if you don't just take on an ad hoc, inconsistent interpretation of the two, like Piper does and others that we talked about in the last episode? So moving on here, he says, there is election and reprobation, he writes. We cannot avoid the fact with mental gymnastics. And again, there are many quasi-Calvinists who are trying to avoid reprobation because they don't like it, or they don't want to have to deal with it. They want to claim the good parts of Calvinism without accepting the negative, and a lot of them will do a lot of mental gymnastics to get there. However, he writes, once we affirm double predestination, we have to ask what kind of double predestination we affirm. Even within the communion of Reformed theology, there's an ongoing debate about that very question. Most agree that predestination is double. The debate is over how to understand the double aspect. Pause. Notice that there's disagreement even among Reformed theologians, okay? This is one of the reasons that sometimes you'll be accused of not understanding Calvinism because you're not representing their form of Calvinism. Just like I mentioned earlier, there are different kinds of Arminians. I'm sure there are different kinds of even provisionists, okay? And so sometimes it seems like you might be misrepresenting Calvinism when the truth is you're misrepresenting their specific kind of Calvinism. And some people are more educated than others to recognize there are different aspects of Reformed theology, even among the Reformed. And so I just want to point that out. He continues, one view sometimes called hyper-Calvinism teaches a symmetrical view of predestination, or equal ultimacy. A symmetrical view of double predestination holds that in the case of the elect, God decreed their election from eternity, and in the fullness of time intervenes in their lives and creates saving faith in their hearts by his grace. God invades the soul of the elect and quickens them from spiritual death to spiritual life and brings them to faith in Christ. In a symmetrical manner, the reprobate are doomed from eternity, and God in fullness of time intrudes into their lives and creates fresh evil in their souls, ensuring their ultimate reprobation and damnation. This symmetrical view believes that God works grace by direct intrusion, and he works hardening by creating evil in the reprobate in an equal manner. However, this is not the Orthodox Reformed doctrine of double predestination, and I do not hold to that symmetrical view or equal ultimacy. Now, stop there for a second, okay? So he's condemning this concept of equal ultimacy because God is not, quote unquote, working evil into the hearts of people in the same way that he's supposedly working good in the hearts of the elect. But what is he doing instead? He's just letting them do what they, quote unquote, do naturally, is what he's going to go on to argue. But what does that mean on a worldview where all things are sovereignly and unchangeably decreed by God before the creation of the world? Do you understand the point? In other words, what is to say, well, they're doing what they're doing naturally. God is not working it in them to do it. What do they mean when they say he's doing it naturally? We don't believe in Mother Nature here. I mean, Calvinists don't believe that that man's nature is somehow independent of the sovereign decree of God. In other words, this seems to be a distinction without a difference to me. At least I don't see any real distinction with a difference between what he just argued as equal ultimacy and what he's going to argue for as the orthodox position of Reformed theology, which he writes, quoting on, he says, I hold to positive negative view of double predestination. A positive negative distinction in predestination is this. In the case of the elect, God positively intervenes in their lives to rescue them from their corrupt condition. Pause. This would be irresistible grace on the I on tulip, right? So God is positively intervening with irresistible grace, the effectual calling, regeneration, whatever you want to call it, right? He's intervening to change their hearts, to give them new birth, right? He's intervening to do what? To change their corrupt condition. Now, pause. How did their condition become corrupt in the first place? If not by sovereign decree? Who, if not God, sovereignly decreed that because Adam fell, everybody would be born in a condition where it was corrupt and they would only reject the things of God? And how is that not active? How is that not just as active as what he's doing for the elect? You tell me. I do not see how Calvinists think they're getting around this quandary by calling for a positive negative view of double predestination versus a positive view. It's a distinction without a difference, at least as far as I can tell. He goes on to write, the Holy Spirit changes their hearts of stone. Now, stop. Why are their hearts of stone in the first place, Calvinists? If not, they were born hearts of stone by sovereign decree because Adam sinned by sovereign decree. You're not getting around anything. You might as well just say positive, positive, because it makes no distinction with a difference. It's just it's a vernacular change. There's no substantive difference as far as I can tell. Now, granted, maybe it's a lacking in my own cognitive abilities. Okay. Maybe I'm just not bright enough to see it. Now, I might believe that that's the case if I had not had discussions with William Lane Craig and much more intelligent brains than mine, who virtually in our discussions said, yeah, it seems to be just an appeasement of sorts. It seems to be just almost an outward thing of saying that somehow distinguishes us as having a just view of God versus that other very unjust view of God. That positive double predestination, that equal ultimacy of that's just a hyper high view of hyper Calvinism. But our view is much, much better, even though all it is a verbiage difference without a distinction. Again, how am I wrong about that? Explain to me a substantive difference between these two perspectives. So he writes, the hearts of stone to hearts alive to the things of God. That is his positive intervention, he writes. In the case of the reprobate, God works negatively insofar as he passes over them. Okay? So like the story of the Samaritan, the priest and the Levite, they pass over or they pass by their enemies. Well, that's what God does to his enemies, apparently, on Calvinism. He passes them over. But this passing over, what is he passing over if not someone born by nature, which is in accordance with what God sovereignly decreed for them to be born, in a condition where they cannot understand and respond positively even to the light and revelation of God? Answer me that. So he passes over, he leaves them, quote unquote, to their own devices, as if their own devices aren't also within the meticulous providence of God's sovereign decree. Again, Sproul is not alive for me to ask him these questions, nor would I think he probably even entertain me. But Calvinist, what's the distinction with the difference here? If their own devices are truly within their control, I can understand this as being a point maybe worth making. But saying that he's left them to their own devices, but their devices are born in such a condition that they can only reject and denounce the things of God because he sovereignly decreed for them to be born in that condition, the T of the tulip, then I see no real distinction, substantive distinction with a difference. He goes on to say, but he does not intrude in their lives to create fresh evil. What does that mean? Create fresh evil as opposed to the evil you preordained before the foundation of the world to unchangeably come to pass? Because it would be fresh if he was doing it live right now, present active, but because he predestined it prior to creation, then it's not fresh, and therefore God somehow gets off the hook as being unjust. What is your point? Again, I'm not trying to be mean. Notice I am not attacking the character of the man. This argument is weak, as far as I can tell. Again, I could believe it's maybe just Leighton, you're not well trained enough. You're not cognitive. You're not cognitively capable of really grasping this complex esoteric teaching, and maybe you just don't really get it. But if I hadn't had so many conversations with people who I know are very, very well educated and very bright, who say it's exactly the problem, and anyone who has not already swallowed the system hook, line, and sinker, and they're intellectually honest enough to go, yeah, that is kind of a blight on us. We have to just own that blight. Kevin, thank you for your super chat. He writes, Dr. Flowers, you're making too much sense. We are not supposed to use this much logic when determining truth. Yeah. Well, sometimes it feels like that. It can feel like that. Thank you. All right, moving along. The mass, he says, in the mass of fallen humanity, some receive the saving grace of God. God intervenes. What is he? This is exactly what was brought up in a Twitter exchange recently about God intervening. What is he intervening into? Intervening means to be seems to be like you're stepping in to intervene means like you're stepping into something to change it. What is God intervening into except his own divine decree, his own divine plan? And so you could argue that, well, God actually decrees his intervention within his plan of creation, and that's fine. But what is he intervening then into except what he has already determined to take place? So God intervenes to rescue them from the very sinful condition that he decreed for them to have from birth. Now, he's not saying that, I'm saying that, but that's what he believes based upon the system of tulip. The T, the sinful condition of man, is from birth. The man has no control of how he's born in that condition. He's born like that. And therefore, he has no control over this sinful condition. This is a condition he was born under. And because he was born in that condition, according to the Calvinist theology, he cannot respond positively even to God's own offers of reconciliation from that condition, unless God unilaterally picked him before he was born and effectually causes him to want to change. And again, I see that nowhere in the pages of Scripture. So he goes on to write, he passes over the remainder. Again, like the priest and the Levite, he passes on the other side of the road of his enemies, according to Calvinism. Even though Jesus doesn't do that, and he teaches us not to do that, apparently that's what God does, okay? Those whom he passes over are not elect. They're his enemies. They're not his chosen ones, okay? They are reprobate. They are judged because of the evil already present in them. Let's think about that for a second. Before the twins did anything bad, evil, he's reprobated. And yet here he says they're judged because of evil already in them. So is this the foresight evil view? God foresees the evil of Esau, but he doesn't foresee the faith of Joseph or Jacob, right? Do you see the inconsistency of the hermeneutic? If it's not obvious, open your eyes, because this is a huge blight on the hermeneutic of what we read earlier from RC Sproul when he talks about Jacob and Esau representing the elect and the reprobate. That before they did anything good or bad, he chooses them. And it's not a choice for service, like on our perspective, of the nations being chosen to be the seed through which the law, the prophets, the covenants, the Messiah, and his message would come, like verse 4 and 5 actually says. No, on Calvinism, it is supposed to be representing God's unconditional election for salvation or reprobation, and yet he says they're judged because of the evil already present within them. How is that consistent, Calvinists? Which is in view in this portion of Romans 9. God and Pharaoh, he writes. Paul quotes what God says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up. In this case, it is not enough to say that God permits Pharaoh to sin. It is not enough to say that God's will is involved only so far as God stayed out of the picture altogether and left Pharaoh to his own devices. That is an attractive way to handle the text, but I do not think it is sufficient to deal with Paul's teaching. God not only has allowed Pharaoh to continue in willful disobedience, but he also has raised him up. A better way to translate this text is the way I have, quote, I have appointed you to this task. The eternal God Almighty raised up Pharaoh, set him at the seat of power over the Egyptians, and gave him power to rule over his own people and the Israelite slaves. God put Pharaoh in a position of power for the purpose of showing his own power. What is that parallel? God raised up the Pharisees, the leaders, the teachers of the law in Israel, for the very purpose of displaying his power through the crucifixion, through the second Passover. And so, yes, God can take rebellious people, he can raise them up to places of influence, harden them or blind them in their rebellion, and use them to bring about his purpose of redemption. And he's not guilty at all for inciting them to sin or causing them to be sinners in the first place. Why? Because he has not sovereignly and unchangeably ordained their evil or their sin. He simply knows and uses them in their rebellion, raises them up and he puts them in the places that he needs them to be in order for his purposes to be accomplished through their rebellious actions, which is exactly what he does with Judas and Pontius Pilate and all of the leaders that he uses within the crucifixion to bring about his purpose and his plan. And so Calvinists will often point to Pharaohs being hardened or the Israelites being hardened as proof for Calvinism, when in reality, it's not proof for Calvinism at all. It's proof that God judicially hardens people who are already in rebellion, not that he reprobates them before they're ever born. And that's why the interlocutor is objecting against judicial hardening, not against reprobation. The Calvinist assumes that the objector is objecting against double predestination and reprobation, when in reality, the objector is objecting against the concept and idea of judicially hardening your chosen people in order to engraft in these barbarian, non-law-abiding citizens of other countries, these barbarian Gentiles. That's the objector in the mind of Paul. When you see that, you go, I don't even know how Calvinists sometimes come to the conclusions they come to, given the context. All right. Continuing on with he starts quoting scripture again, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be declared in all the earth. Verse 17b. Luther said that the people of Israel were makletos, without any might. All the power was invested in Pharaoh, and it was invested there by the Lord, God omnipotent. In the face of God's power, Pharaoh's power was impotent. We all agree with that, okay? In other words, free will is not a superpower. Just because Pharaoh is acting freely to rebel against the things of God does not mean that God's will is going to be thwarted. Just because people are unfaithful doesn't mean God's plan is going to fail, okay? Just like when you're casting lots, just because you're casting lots doesn't mean that God's purpose is going to fail when you're using lots as a means to make decisions, okay? In the face of God's power, Pharaoh's power was impotent. And as far as God says to Pharaoh, I appointed you to this position, not to show the world how much, not to show the world how much power you have, Pharaoh, but to show the world my power. That's why I appointed you to this task. So my people, in their powerlessness, their maktelos, might know where the power of their salvation lies. So, moving to the next section here, the removal of divine restraint. Before we jump into verse 18, I'm going to take a drink and look at the side chat real quick. Okay, continuing on in verse 18. Therefore, he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills, he hardens. Now, let's stop there and just think about that for a moment. If you missed last episode, you may not know where we come from when we are understanding that he's quoting from the Exodus event, where he talks about he has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, he'll have compassion on whom he wants to have compassion. And that was in the context of Israel, who had built the golden calf, and God was going to destroy them. Moses prays, and God relents, and he does not destroy them. He has mercy on them. Mercy is to refrain from punishing people who deserve to be punished. So he refrains from punishing Israel, destroying them when they deserve to be destroyed in order to fulfill his promise. And he can harden Israel when it serves his promise. In other words, if God wants to harden a already rebellious Jew in his rebellion so as to ensure that he cries out when he's supposed to, crucify him, give us Barabbas, in order to bring about the plan of redemption for the world, then who are you to question God, O man? You cannot talk back to God if he resculpts and remakes an already marred vessel for a good purpose for him. In other words, he uses Pharaoh to bring about his purpose and his plan of redemption through the first Passover. In the same way, he's hardening the Pharisees to ensure the second Passover. And who are you to question whether God does that? That's what he's getting to on our perspective. What is he getting to on RC Sproul's perspective? Well, he's getting to double predestination. God reprobates some people and elects some people unilaterally before they're born. And who are you to question God for doing that? That's basically what he's getting at. So Sproul writes, on the surface, it sounds once again as though there is a balance, a symmetry, in which God melts the hearts of the elect and calcifies the hearts of the reprobate. The Bible does say, not only here, but throughout the Exodus account, that God repeatedly hardens the heart of Pharaoh. How do we understand that? First, both Pharaoh and God were involved. So in a very real sense, God was actively involved in the hardening of the heart of a human being. But how exactly did God harden the heart of Pharaoh? How does he harden anybody's heart? He does so not by mere permission, but by a divine decision that we see again and again, particularly in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, where God deals with the impenitent sinners by giving them over to their sin. Now, I'm actually agreeing with him on this part. So some people think that that's uniquely Calvinistic for God to that's what judicial hardening is. It's the act of a judge to cut somebody off in their rebellion. We just don't believe he's doing it unilaterally. In other words, we don't believe that he chose to unilaterally damn Pharaoh to hell before Pharaoh did anything good or bad before creation. Okay. We believe that God, knowing Pharaoh's heart, chooses to use him in his rebellion to bring about a purpose through him. Okay. And so there's a big difference between using somebody in their free rebellion versus decreeing them to be rebellious so as to use them. Let me say that again and make it really clear. There's a big difference between knowing somebody is rebellious and using them in that rebellion for a good purpose versus decreeing them, i.e. determining them to be rebellious so as to use them for a good purpose. And the Calvinists, based upon their belief in theistic determinism, i.e. the sovereign decree of God, has God not only using people in their evil behavior to bring about a good purpose, but ultimately God determining, i.e. decreeing, i.e. causally bringing to pass their evil so as to use them for his good purposes. And that's where we part ways. That's why you see a lot of the things that Calvinists say aligning with what we believe in some aspects of it. In other words, same vocabulary, different dictionary, because he could be arguing for God's judicial hardening of an already calcified, hardened heart and molding and using that calcified heart for his good purposes, versus what, obviously Calvinists are teaching with regard to the T of tulip, and that they're born in that condition, they can't help it, and that they're ultimately victims of, in a sense, of the divine decree. God decreed them to be born this way, and they could not have done otherwise. Versus they chose to do this freely, and therefore they're fully deserving of their sins, of what comes their way, and their judgment over them and for what they're doing. They're fully responsible for that because they could have done otherwise. They should have done otherwise, and God would have used them as vessels of honor had they cleansed themselves, as Paul wrote to Timothy when he said that within a household there are many earthen vessels, and cleanse yourself so that you may be used for the honorable purposes versus the common use. So he even lays that out in his own discourse, Paul does. And so Paul's not going to misuse the same analogy in some other scripture, is he? Of course not. What's he saying? You could be used for a good purpose. You could be used and chosen by God and molded and used for good purposes if you do what? Repent, cleanse yourself so as to be used for an honorable use versus an ignoble use. So moving on, he writes, in the book of Revelation, we find that the final disposition of the wicked is through this very means. He who is unjust, let him be unjust still. He who is filthy, let him be filthy still. Again, love that verse, but you got to ask yourself the question, who is the unjust on Calvinism? Who is the one who became filthy on Calvinism? Those who became unjust and filthy by sovereign decree, or those who became unjust and filthy by free choice, by their own choice to rebel and not to cleanse themselves, not to repent of their injustice and their filth? Okay, who's really responsible for that on your system? God does not, he writes, have to create any new evil in the human heart. So yeah, he doesn't have to create, quote unquote, on Sproul's view, he doesn't have to create any new evil because he's already sovereignly decreed that evil. So what's the difference? Saying that he has sovereignly and unchangeably decreed it before the creature is born versus to say that he's right now presently active making it happen. What distinction with a difference substantively does that make? None that I can tell. To make someone more wicked than he already is, God need only remove his restraints. one of the greatest mercies. Okay, he needs to remove his restraints. So if he removes his restraints, what is motivating the man now? His free will or God's decrees? So this is why I continue to push in the debate in other places. What is God restraining if not the free will of man, his creature, the creature? If God is restraining something, then there has to be something for him to restrain. He's not restraining his own decree, is he? To permit something or restrain something assumes there is something outside yourself to permit and or restrain, just like intervention seems to assume there's something to intervene outside of your own will. And that's the whole purpose of this. Calvinists continue to point to times in which God restrains the freedom of man's choices or permits the freedom of man's choices as if that proves determinism. And it does just the opposite when you really understand how logic works. He goes on to write, he says, one of the greatest mercies God gives us is keeping us from being as sinful as we possibly could be. Earlier in our study, I mentioned that Reformed theology uses the acronym TULIP to describe our situation of original sin. The T in the acronym stands for total depravity. I do not like the term total depravity. It is misleading. I prefer radical corruption. This is again Sproul talking. The term total depravity suggests that we are as bad as we possibly could be, that we are utterly depraved. Think, however, of all the sins you've committed in your lifetime. Excuse me, as I get a drink. As bad as they have been, they could have been worse. You could have committed more sins, and the sins you have committed could have been more vicious. The same could be said of Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Adolf Hitler. No one has been as sinful as he theoretically could be, not because some island of righteousness holds him back from utter depravity, but because the restraining power of God is a bridle that keeps all in check. When we abuse God's patience and long-suffering, our hearts become harder and harder, and at any moment, God can remove the restraints and give us over to our sin. Now, again, if I was writing all this, it would make perfect sense, I think, within the provisionistic framework, but I do not see how it makes sense within a theistic deterministic framework, because when it says when we abuse God's patience and long-suffering, did God decree for us to abuse his patience and long-suffering? In other words, why did Charles Manson, to use one of his examples, abuse God's patience and long-suffering? And what is God being patient and long-suffering with, if not the free will of Charles Manson? What is he being patient on? Is he waiting on his own decree to come to fruition? What's he long-suffering? Long-suffering means to suffer long, to wait eagerly, to hold out hope for something to happen. What's he doing that for? His own decree? Like he's waiting on Charles Manson to do what? Being patient with Charles Manson to do what? What he decreed for him to do? What he was born only by natural capacities according to the sovereign decree to be able to do? Again, none of this makes rational sense as far as I can tell within the theistic deterministic framework. He goes on, he says, at any moment, he says, God can remove the restraints. So if he removes the restraints, what's happening then? Then there's free will? Is that what you're trying to say? That then God's sovereign decree just goes away if he removes his restraints, right? No. He removes his restraints so that the guy will continue to do what he's already sovereignly decreed to do. Again, none of this makes any rational sense unless you hold to some perspective of libertarian freedom. Consistent Calvinist, I think that's Colin, if I'm not mistaken. He's asking a question. Leighton, on your view, why does God hold out hope for someone he knows will never accept him? Because the reason he knows they won't accept him is because he held out hope for them and they refuse. In other words, it's a logical order of the decree, just like within Calvinism. There's the logical order of decrees within the supralapsarian, infralapsarian, and the sublapsarians. It's the exact same thing. It's a philosophical quandary. And you present this philosophical quandary as if it's not been answered, Colin. The whole Consolation of Philosophy written by Boethius and C.S. Lewis and Aslam and all these guys get into this issue over and over and over again. It's what Molinism gets into. It's all a philosophical quandary that you're reading into the text and saying, well, if God knows everything, then therefore he must be the one who's determined it, right? And if he knows something and he knows somebody won't accept him, then he must not be wanting to offer that person salvation or that person grace or holding out his hands to them because he already knows they're not going to accept them, right? And logically, in your finite linear way of thinking, that seems rational. But the reason, from the philosophical position that we hold to, the reason he knows this is because he held out his hands to us in time, and because he longed to gather us, and because someone refused him. That's why he knows it. And I know that's philosophically difficult to grasp your mind around, but if you think of God outside of time, and you think of time and space and continuum as that which God has created, then philosophically I think it's perfectly tenable. Now, you may disagree, and you may think that determinism is the only way I can fathom it, and therefore determinism must be the right answer. And if that's what you would like to do, flatten it out that way and say, well, the only way God can know something that we will freely choose to do is by determining us to do it. Well, then you can come to that conclusion. I just don't think it's the conclusion the Scripture comes to, and I don't think it's philosophically sound. I think it's a very flat, very linear, and very finite way of thinking about the infinite God. But you're perfectly within your free will rights to come to that philosophical conclusion if you'd like to. But to pretend that there's not deep, in fact, most philosophers who are theists agree with me on that point. So go have a philosophical discussion with one of those guys. I'm more of a theologian than a philosopher anyway, but either way, even the best of the best philosophical theologians agree with me with regard to that modal fallacy that you continue to make. And it's not anything that hadn't been answered a dozen times before. Okay, so moving on. From Genesis to Revelation, we see that God's abandoning a sinner to wickedness is not an act of unrighteousness on his part. It is a manifestation of his perfect justice. It is as if he is saying, can't get the words out, you want to sin? Be my guest. So here comes the question. Why do they want to sin? Does God decree what your wants are on Calvinism? Well, according to the confessions, he decrees whatsoever comes to pass, and your wants to sin came to pass, didn't they? So why do you want to sin on Calvinism? You've got to ask those kinds of questions as you're going through this in order to understand the quandary that they're creating. He's saying, you want to sin? Be my guest. I'm not going to strive with you anymore. I'm going to take my wraps off. I'm going to loosen the leash and let you do what you want. Again, sounds very much like something I would write. Y'all have heard me talk about this, where God will not contend with man forever. But what is he contending with if not the free will of the creature, right? He's longing to gather them. He's holding out his hands, just like a real parent would be with a real rebellious child. I want them to do the right thing. I want them to follow the rules of the household. I want them to come back into a loving relationship with me, and they are not willing. And you're striving for it, but eventually, if they will continue to rebel, eventually you cut them off and you say, I'm not letting you in the house anymore. I'm not going to feed you anymore. I'm not going to clothe you anymore. I'm not going to take care of you anymore. That's exactly the kind of thing I think is happening between us and the Father. But on Calvinism, that doesn't work because there's not an independent will for which with which he can contend on the Calvinistic worldview, because he's ultimately the one who has decreed the will to be as it is. And so the contention seems to be just superfluous. He goes on to say, I know the desires of your heart are only wicked continually, end quote. Being given over to sin is itself a judgment on sin. That is a biblical principle, he writes. It presupposes an existing sinful condition. Of course, he doesn't, at least yet, Sproul has not even touched on why it is an existing sinful condition of total inability from birth. He just assumes that that's the way it is. And that's where he needs to be pressed on. Usually the strongest points are not the points that your opponent deals with. It's the points your opponent ignores. And Calvinists seem to ignore this issue with regard to the reason that people are born with this existing sinful condition of total moral inability from birth to respond even positively to God's own means of reconciliation with us, then somehow we're not engaging, or they're not going to be willing to engage. So God did not look around Egypt for somebody to appoint to resist Moses, and in the process stumble upon the poor, innocent, righteous young man Pharaoh and say, I will take this benevolent young fellow because he is an able administrator, and I will put him at the seat of power over the Egyptians and make him as evil as I can so that I will get my will done and show my power to the whole world, end quote. That would be sheer cosmic tyranny. Okay, what if God had done that, though? Sproul? What if God had taken this benevolent young fellow who is an able administrator and put him in a seat of power over the Egyptians? What if he'd have done that? And he made him as evil as possible through some secondary causes, made him as evil as possible in order to get his will done and show his power to the whole world. What if he had done that? Would you then really call God a tyrant like you just now did here? Because if it's true that Pharaoh became what he did because he was sovereignly and unchangeably decreed to do so by you, by God, I mean, under your view of Calvinism, then how is that any different than what you just explained as tyranny? Tyranny. How do you pronounce that? Tyranny. That would be right. How is it different with the distinction? I'd love to know. He calls it cosmic tyranny, but it sounds a lot like theistic determinism to me, but somehow it's not, mysteriously. And he goes, and this is not what God did. He hardened a man who was already hard. Grant that right there. By the way, this is so interesting. I wish I had it with me. I was just reading John Piper's commentary on Romans 9 recently. And John Stott, who was the other guy? John Stott and is an older Calvinist. Okay, I can't remember who it is. Well, even Morris Moo, some of the newer modern day Calvinists, they made the statement in their commentaries: God never hardens somebody who is not already hard. In other words, he doesn't arbitrarily cut somebody off in their rebellion. He cuts people off who are already rebellious. He doesn't just cut people off for no apparent reason. And these were Calvinists saying this, much like what Sproul is saying right here. He hardened a man who's already hard by his own self-will, right? John Piper is intelligent enough and logical enough and I guess intellectually honest enough to come out and say, that's not true. That's not right. And I wish I had the quotes here so you could see it for yourself, because Piper spends 2 paragraphs contending with other Calvinists who say what Sproul is saying here. And I might actually go get that and pull it into the screen next time we get on this, because that whole conflict between John Piper and other Calvinists like Sproul is arguing here that God will harden a man who is already hard. That's our view, because they're already hard because of their own free choices, not because of a nature they were born with by sovereign decree. And I guess if Sproul was here, I think what he would say is, well, the reason they're already hard is because they were born under the sin of Adam and they inherited his guilt and his condemnation, and therefore that already hardness that he was in was, yes, in accordance with what God divinely decreed for him to be from birth, but it's not like he was going against his will. He was doing what he wants. And because he's doing what he wants, that's the reason he's guilty. But of course, what he wants is in accordance with his nature, which is in accordance with the divine decree. And so it's again, no real distinction with a difference between the different perspectives. So Pharaoh, he writes, could not say before God, God, what's going on here? You are punishing me for the hardness of my heart while you have been making sure that my heart gets hardened. That's not fair. Yes, it is fair. It is perfect justice for God to give an evil one over to evil. That sounds like something we would say as provisionists, doesn't it? Because he's giving them over to their free choices to do evil and to refuse to humble themselves. He's giving them over to their own unbelief and rebellion. He is not giving them over to something he decreed them to already be from birth. And that, again, is the difference between the two view. Okay, dealing with some of the side chat stuff. I think, Paul Anchor, I think you're a Calvinist, if I'm not mistaken. Forgive me if I'm wrong. Type on the side chat whether you're a Calvinist or not. I think you're one of the Calvinist residents, Calvinists, based upon earlier the chats that you made, but I may be mistaken. So forgive me if you are. You make the point. Sin is self-hardening by nature. Yes, it's true. You're exactly right. When you continue in sin, when you sin, you will continue to grow hardened naturally. In other words, it's the natural thing that will happen if you continue in sin. But that does not mean that you can't confess that fact and stop. Just like drinking alcohol repeatedly naturally leads to alcoholism, right? Okay. Looking at pornography regularly naturally leads to an addiction to pornography, right? Does that mean, therefore, you can't confess that fact, get help, stop, check into a rehab facility, get accountability, put on filters on your computer? Does that mean you can't do anything about it? No. That's the problem. We don't have a problem saying that sin is addictive. What we have a problem is saying is that sin is addictive, therefore you can't confess that fact, even in light of the law and the gospel, because that's what the T of total inability teaches. And that's not the Bible. That's Calvinism. And again, you may, oh, no, Paul is a Calvinist. So good. That was directed to you then. Learn from it, if you will. That was my Jedi mind trick on you. So I was trying to believe in provisionism. Yeah. All right, Amos. Sorry, just messing around with you. Okay, Amos, thank you for your super chat. God's hardening does not turn sheep into donkeys, but it does make donkeys kick on divine cue. He's quoting from Westerholm, I guess. So God's hardening does not turn sheep into donkeys, but it does make donkeys kick on divine cue. That's a really good quote. I like that, Westerholm. Yeah, I need to steal that one. That's good. And what's he saying? He's saying it's not trying to teach that Pharaoh is destined for hell from birth. What's he trying to say? He's taking an already rebellious, hardened sinner and causing him to kick on cue. In other words, I need this rebellious sinner who's in power to not let the people go just because the Nile turns to blood. Why? Because I've got 3 more plagues to do to demonstrate my power over the false gods of Egypt, and I would rather him not kick until the cue. Great quote. Thank you for that, Amos. Really good illustration of that. All right. Looking at other side chat questions. Y'all got some good. The theology geek in me wants to just jump into the side chat, even though they may not pertain to what we're actually talking about. Okay, consistent Calvinist is saying something here. Let me read this. Any heart that was ever hardened could be said to have been hardened by God. I could see that would be consistent Calvinism, yes. So what you seem to be saying is that any heart that's ever hardened could be said to be hardened by God, okay? That's transcendent description of what's occurring. It's both one in light of the other. I think the consistent Calvinist, based upon other things I've heard you say, I think this is where you argue from the transcendent versus the story level immanent concepts. And so you've got, like Chris Date, you've got God authoring everything that takes place, like he wrote a script before it happens in his transcendence. And then what's happening in time is the story level. And so on the story level, it's actually doing these things. But the reason we're doing it is because God authored it. I've heard the stories, heard the analogies, disagree with them because it's just hard determinism, packed up in a nice little analogy of how beings act in accordance with what someone has scripted them to act. And that to me is just as bad as the robot analogy, just as bad as the puppet analogy, just as bad as every other analogy where you have inanimate objects being acted upon and by something outside themselves that they have ultimately no control over, because you're just a character in a play, a character in a story. And it gives no meaning to real life and relationship, in my estimation. And I understand how you might be content with it, but I'm not. And the reason I'm not content with it is because God authored me not to be content with it when he wrote the book in his transcendent ways. So take it up with him and tell him to rewrite his book so that Leighton won't do this broadcast anymore if you've got a problem with me. And I love you, brother. You are very consistent. Your Calvinism, I have to admit. All right, Potter and Clay. And back to the book. All right, here we go. Potter and clay. At this point in the text, Paul is expecting another objection. He has already heard this one. Is there unrighteousness with God? Verse 14. Now, stop. Why do we believe the interlocutor, the objector in Paul's mind, would think there's unrighteousness with God? Because we know why Sproul thinks there's unrighteousness with God in the mind of the interlocutor, because of reprobation, double predestination. What is more unjust intuitively than double predestination, for goodness sake? I mean, that is the most unjust thing I can ever think of. So that must be what Paul has in mind, right? Or could it be the same thing he had in mind in Romans 3? That if God is hardening his chosen people to engraft the barbarian Gentiles, who are you to talk back to God? If he uses you in your rebellion in the same way he used Pharaoh in his rebellion to bring about the first Passover, he's going to use you Israelites in your rebellion to bring about the second Passover. Then who are you to talk back to God if he takes an already marred, hardened lump of clay and reshapes it and remolds it to be used to kick when he commands it on cue? Who are you to question him for doing that? That's the interlocutor in the mind of Paul. And when you understand that, Calvinism just, because reprobation goes away. Double predestination, no point in it. It's absurd. It's a moot point from that point forward. He writes, now, as soon as Paul mentions Pharaoh's hardening, he heads off to the objection because he knows what follows. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For he has resisted his will. Verse 19. Paul does not answer that question. He does not slip into Arminianism and say, the reason he still finds fault is that all the sin is found in man. So it is dependent upon what people do with their choices. We find none of that here. Well, it's because Paul is not talking about Arminianism or Calvinism here. He's talking about the hardening of Israel so as to bring about his plan and purpose of redemption and the ingrafting of the Gentiles here. He's not talking in soteriological concepts of choosing to reprobate some and to damn others, which Calvinists like Sproul are reading into this text. He goes on to write, Paul's response to this anticipated objection is simply a moral rebuke. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Verse 20a. Before Paul begins to answer the question, he calls the objector to remember who he is and who God is. He is basically saying to those who constantly carp against God's sovereignty, who do you think you are? Again, remember what God's sovereignty means for a Calvinist is determinism, theistic determinism. So who are you to harp against God theistically determining everything that happens? Is basically the way he thinks that Paul's getting into. Versus, who do you think you are, you rebellious Jews, for harping against God, remolding and remaking and reshaping you to be vessels through which he would bring about his plan and his purposes through your rebellion, crying out, crucify. And when you're crucifying your own Messiah, and yet God is bringing his purpose and his plan through your rebellious actions so as to graft in people who don't obey the law, who are barbarians, who believe in a carpenter's kid from Nazareth. How dare you talk back to the sovereign if he wants to establish his covenant with people who are not law keepers from the nation of Israel? That's the point he's getting to. Remember Job, Sproul writes, he was the victim of much injustice at the hands of men and Satan. Here's RC Sproul running off to other text, right? No, what's he doing? He's trying to back up his perspective by quoting from other examples in Scripture. I'm pointing that out just because I hear in my mind sometimes the James White fans going, oh, there he goes running off to other texts when he's getting an exposition of Romans 9 or exposition of a particular passage. He runs off to other texts. How many other texts has R.C. Sproul quoted in his exposition so far? So, some of you are interesting in your rebukes of me and my approach to these things, saying you're just not being fair, Leighton. You're not even trying to represent us correctly. And like I said in the very first episode, I'd put my commentary here in the Potter's Promise up next to this one any day of the week from R.C. Sproul, and you judge which is more fair, because notice that when he gives the 4 different views of Arminianism earlier, the 4 different perspectives or ways in which people get around Romans 9 from a Calvinistic vantage point, remember? And we showed how caricatured they were and how much of a straw man they were of the corporate view and the foresight faith view, or the election to service view. He completely maligns all those views, and he doesn't cite one source, not one footnote citing a provisionist or someone like a Brian Abishano who holds to the corporate view of election, a Jack Cottrell who holds to the election to service perspective. He didn't quote any leading scholar whatsoever in the demonstration of his views. And I've got my commentary here. Matter of fact, wait, I can put it up online here. You can look at it but let's look at it here. Okay, let's just see who's more fair. Okay, in fact, I didn't even realize I was opening up to In All Fairness, because that was a section of the book there. This is page 5 of the Potter's Promise right there. It happens to be In All Fairness. And what do I write? If you do not already know what Calvinism is, is all about. I recommend that you study the teachings of Calvinists themselves and keep in mind that not all Calvinists are the same. Does that sound fair to you guys? Did you ever hear anything like that from R.C. Sproul whenever he was caricaturing the various views of Arminians? Did he ever say, you should go study an Arminian scholar for himself? Did he ever say that? Or anything remotely similar to that? Or did he just could caricature it without one single citation? Who's being more fair, guys? I say, I think you should go learn Calvinism from Calvinists. And then I go on to talk about Calvinistic teachings, okay? And who do I quote? Look at my citations here. I quote from Phil Johnson, who is a leading Calvinist today, modern day Calvinist. And just trying to give you a citation here. Another citation there. Who do I quote from in my fourth citation? John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion. So I'm actually going to the sources to tell you who says what, okay? And just kind of scrolling through the book here. Gilbert Van Order, The Calvinist Conflicts, Examination of the Problems of the Reformed Theology. I quote from John Calvin again. I quote from Calvin again here, and the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Just scrolling through to look at the citations. Statement of Faith, traditional. So I'm quoting from my own sources, from people who agree with me, as well as from Calvinist sources as well, from Armoraldian sources and those kinds of things as well. I point out that some Calvinists disagree on double predestination and argue that it does not predestination the non-elect to damnation. In other words, I'm pointing out that there's differing views, just like Sproul did, on the concept of double predestination there in that citation, number 11 there on page 10. Just scrolling through here to see, that's just chapter 1 so far. John Calvin, concerning the eternal predestination of God, I quote from him. I quote from James White here, The Potter's Promise. I quote from several there. There's dictionary quotations. I'm just kind of throwing through here. This is MacArthur, John MacArthur. Dave Hunt, Arthur Pink. In other words, there's an Arminian scholar and there's a Calvinist scholar right next to each other that I quote. John MacArthur again. And the list can go on. Jerry Walls, another that's more from my perspective, someone I'm quoting. John Piper, quote there. I got a lot of quotes from Piper in there. And that's 2 chapters so far. And look at all the citations. I haven't even gotten into, in fact, to be fair, this has not even got into the commentary of Romans 9 yet. So maybe we're trying to be more fair. Go over to the commentary of Romans 9. You skip ahead. Oh, there you go. I'm quoting from Calvinist John Hendricks from monergism.com. Very first quote. Appendix. Quote from several. There's some Calvinist, and it's a quote from Sproul there about about equal ultimacy, which is exactly what we're covering here. And so I quote from Sproul quite extensively there. Bullinger about differing ways in which the word hate is used in the Old Testament or New Testament, as well as Old Testament. A.B. Bruce quote from. Jack Cottrell, which is, again, a leading Arminian scholar who holds to more of a election to service. Piccarilli, another Arminian scholar. Four Lines, another Arminian scholar I'm quoting from, to just support my citation. In other words, here's other scholars, leading scholars who agree with my particular interpretation. Calvinistic scholar William Shedd, I quote from there. Jack Cottrell, I quote from again there. And so make several caveats as to differing views among both perspectives is one of the reasons the citations are there. John Stott, I quote from. This is where I get into the hardening that he never hardens, and it's Stott and Morris. That's what I was trying to remember earlier. Stott and Morris are the ones that harden. Well, let me just point this out. This is John Piper right here. Okay, this is from my book. John Piper. Okay, this John Stott, a Calvinist scholar, quotes another Calvinist scholar in Romans, God's good news for the world. Okay, Dr. Leon Morris rightly comments, neither here nor anyone else is God said to harden anyone who had not first hardened himself. That Pharaoh hardened his heart against God and refused to humble himself is made plain in the story. This is a Calvinist, okay? A Calvinist is saying this. This is why I like quoting Calvinists when we agree with them. And I agree with Morris here, okay? So God's hardening of him was a judicial act, abandoning him to his own stubbornness, much as God's wrath against the ungodly is expressed by giving them over to their own depravity. So the judicial hardening is giving somebody over, strengthening one in their own resolve, which is exactly what Sproul seemed to be arguing too. But notice this, John Piper, however, disagrees with Stott and Morris, stating in response to the quote above, "Let me say this calmly and firmly. That is exactly the opposite of what Romans 9:18 teaches." From John Piper, "The Hardening of Pharaoh and the Hope of the World," end quote. The quote shows where it's taken from there. In other words, John Piper disagrees that God is hardening people who are already hardened in their self-rebellion. He takes issue with that. I mentioned that earlier, and I wanted to give you a citation for it. There it is in my book. So what am I trying to prove here? I'm trying to demonstrate something that you will hear oftentimes on social media, this accusation, "Oh, Leighton, you're just not fair. You don't understand Calvinism. You're just not..." Listen, I am more fair than at least one of the leading Calvinistic voices that is known in our world today, RC Sproul. I would contend that I'm more fair than all of the leading Calvinist voices when it comes to their representation of the non-Calvinistic side. And again, this is just a demonstration of that. In other words, it's demonstrably true that I'm not just claiming this because of a bias in favor of myself here. I'm demonstrating to you how I'm more fair and am doing better scholarship to represent my opponents than a leading Calvinistic scholar is in his exposition of Romans 9. And so you be the judge of that, okay? You be the judge of that. So, all right, let's keeping on with the book here because we could go forever on the side chat stuff. Okay, he says, "Remember Job. He was the victim of much injustice at the hands of men and Satan. He suffered affliction without relief. Finally, he raised his fist against heaven and shook it in the face of God. God answered Job by means of lengthy, relentless interrogation." And he reads from Job there. Not that I'm trying to skip any of this. I'm just trying to hurry through this because I'm taking too long. And so he goes through Job. He explains Job, what the problem is with Job. Nothing I really disagree with any of that aspect of it, okay? "The absolute integrity and righteousness of the Almighty God is not to be questioned. Will the thing formed say to whom who formed it, 'Why have you made me like this?'" Verse 20b, "Pharaoh could not shake his fist at God and ask, 'Why have you hardened my heart?' God owed Pharaoh no explanation. Pharaoh's heart had no inherent righteousness. God used Pharaoh for his glorious, holy, merciful, gracious plan of salvation." Now, when you say Pharaoh's heart had no inherent righteousness, again, I don't think he has anything that's righteous enough to maintain his salvation, but he does have, according to Romans 1 and 2, he has no excuse for his unbelief because he had what he needed to know clearly made known to him, the attributes of God, and he clearly could have and should have believed in the revelation, the light he'd been given. So he had that. He also has an inborn conscience within him, the law of God written on his heart. So he knows the difference between right and wrong. Now, if you want to call that righteousness, I mean, be my guest. It's not what we should call it, I don't think, because it's not the kind of righteousness that would lead to salvation because all of us fall short. And so it's not the righteousness of Christ. It's not perfection. But you do have blameworthiness. Why? Because you could have believed and you should have believed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh did have a conscience and he could have done otherwise and he should have done otherwise. And that's something where the Calvinist systematic, I think, doesn't allow for that. So he writes, God used Pharaoh for his glorious, holy, merciful, and gracious plan of salvation. I agree with that. Using somebody for something and creating them for something is a completely different thing. So if you destine from before they're ever born and create somebody, mold them to be this vessel and cause them to be that vessel through means, whatever the means they may be that you want to describe them as, that he's doing, and using him for that glorious, merciful, gracious end, then I don't see how you can maintain James chapter 1 or 1 John 2:16, that pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world, or that when you're tempted, don't say that God tempts you, and that this is not from the Father, but from the world. I don't know how you can maintain that kind of thing while at the same time saying that ultimately God's the one who transcendently authored it. He's the one who wrote it all in his decreed script before the foundation of the world, while still trying to maintain some semblance of responsibility of the characters that he's causally determining to be what they are by scripting it through whatever means. Okay. We hit now into the vessels of wrath and mercy. And we may be just doing this forever. So we come to one chapter and then the next. And because of my long-windedness and my engagement with all the fun side chat stuff, we never get to go through 2 chapters. I was wanting to go through 2, but we'll save Vessels of Wrath and Mercy for another show. Gives us more fodder for discussion for a later time, which is always good anyway. So I appreciate those who've taken the time to theology geek out with me on this particular Saturday afternoon. And I'm looking now just quickly through some of the side chat, because I do like to engage with questions. If you do have a specific question or challenge or comment, and you stated it a long time ago, like I said, these scroll pretty quickly. So you can recopy, repaste, state it again to my attention. That would be great. Put the word question there or something like that if you want to, or my name, so that I see it. And I will try to engage with some of those things here as we bring this this plane to land. Believe in Jesus is saying, that's my main contention with Calvinists, and they cannot truthfully look somebody directly in the eyes and without a shadow of doubt say, I know for a fact that Christ died and rose for you. Yeah, that is one, I think, of many of the quandaries that at least some Calvinists, depending on what kind of Calvinist you are, deals with regard to the extent of the atonement. Because if you don't believe that Christ died for the sins of the world, for all people, then it's impossible for you to be able to say with any kind of without any kind of hesitation, Christ died for you. You don't know that he did on Calvinism, at least 5-point Calvinism. Let's scroll through here, and I'll take a drink. One moment. Making the point that if God's not logical by nature, then it leaves that he's illogical by nature, and that's part of the problem. Anybody who knows anything about apologetics knows that if you prove something to be illogical, then you've falsified it. And so, yeah, logic is actually important. Let's see. Just again, sorry for the silence, but it's the only way I know how to read. I can't usually talk and read at the same time. Okay, Peter W. is asking a question. When and why did you decide to do this series on RC Sproul? How much of your motivation was personal involving James White? I don't know that there had anything to do with James White, honestly. I know I've mentioned James White's accusations against my exposition of Romans 9 could meet similar critique, but I point that out just simply to show the bias and the double standard. I did the exposition because whenever I opened my Amazon page and was looking at commentators and commentaries on Romans 9, this was one of the best sellers. And that's when I opened it up and started reading it for myself and going, oh my gosh, this thing is horrible. The fact that it had things within it that point to the double standard that Calvinists often have with their own scholars, me pointing that out is not motivation for the reason I picked it. Let's see. No, you're right. Yeah, it will not be. Yeah, Jordan is saying this is not going to be one of the top commentators among scholars. No, it will not. I think even scholarly Calvinists will. I think if they were being very frank and not being disrespectful to Sproul as an individual, I think most scholarly Calvinists will even say this is not a academic exposition or exegesis of Romans 9. This is really more of a polemic against Arminianism, if anything. All right. I think I got all the questions, that at least ones that were posted. before I bring this to a close. And once again, I just want to say thanks, guys, for tuning in this afternoon. Appreciate those. Yeah. Somebody's mentioning Morris and Moo, both Morris and Moo, I would recommend as pretty good academic, scholarly, Calvinistic-ish commentators. Pritchett and I were talking about this, and it's funny because reading some of these guys, they'll sound just like I would sound if I was explaining Romans 9. In other words, they come to the same conclusions even with regard to Pharaoh, in regard to the comparison to Israel, and a lot of the same things, that they won't harden anybody that hasn't grown hardened, and make a lot of the same exact arguments that I make, and the same applications and the same cross references, exactly as I would make them as a provisionist, or an Arminian would make them, for that matter. Okay. And then they'll make all the same application, and then they'll get to a sentence like at the end, and they'll make a caveat. But this does not change the fact that God, by his sovereign decree, I mean, in other words, it's almost like it feels like, I know I can't philosophize Moo. I don't know his motivations. I'm not trying to say I know his motivations, but what it feels like to me when I read that is, it feels like to me is they came to a honest conclusion about where the text took them, but they know who's paying the check, so to speak. They know they're in a Reformed theological seminary or whatever it is, and they know they're Reformed, and they need to, though they've just drawn conclusions that are anything but Calvinistic, I still have to make a Calvinistic statement here to make that all okay, almost. That's what it felt like. Again, you can read it for yourself. Y'all be your own judge. That's what Pritchett and I came to the conclusion of. It's almost like some of them are such good exegetes that they come to the right conclusion, as we would say, which right, obviously that's subjective, but we would agree with their conclusions. That's a very non-Calvinistic conclusion, in fact. But then they make a statement that contradicts, just out of the blue, the conclusion they just brought from the text, which is especially baffling. In fact, I may try to bring in someone like a Moo commentary or Morris commentary, one of these other commentaries that are like that, and give you examples of what I'm talking about, because it's one thing for me just to say that without showing you, but I want to demonstrate that for you. I want to show you, like what I just did it there when I read my citation from my book, The Potter's Promise, and I was reading there from Stott, a Calvinistic scholar, and that little statement that I read right there is, in some ways, I may make it bigger, an example of what I'm talking about. He's making a statement right here that goes in line exactly with what I would say in my commentary. In fact, that's why I quoted it, okay, because I want to give other leading scholars that are saying this. But then John Piper contends with it, okay? So those are the kinds of examples that I'm talking about. And I think those kinds of things, at least if nothing else, demonstrate that Calvinism has some chinks in their armor with regard to how they interpret the judicial act of hardening in Romans 9, and who the interlocutor actually is in regard to that, which is a point worth making, I think. So Jordan's pointing out that Moo's a pretty good commentary. Of Mice and Gods, says, question, if faith is pleasing to God, then is God more pleased to withhold faith from the majority of the world, since God sits in heavens and does as he pleases? That sounds like a good question for Calvinists. So I'll let consistent Calvinist, if he's still on, maybe he can answer that question, because that's a really good question posed to Calvinists. If faith is pleasing to God, then is God more pleased to withhold faith from a majority of the world? Because on Calvinism, God grants faith by effectual means, right? So God effectually causes people to believe. And if that's what pleases him, you can't please God without faith, and faith is effectually given by God on Calvinism, and God sits in heavens and does what he pleases, and he's pleased by faith, and he's the one who effectuates faith, then why doesn't he give faith, at least to more people, if not to all people? Good question. A Calvinist would have to answer that. I think the Calvinist would just say, who are you, old man, to question God? If he wants to decree for some of his people to be unpleasing to him and then condemn them for their unpleasantness, then who are you to question God? I mean, that basically the way I think a Calvinist consistently would have to answer it, if they're going to answer it. They might say it in a little nicer words than I just did, but I think that's basically what they would have to say. All right. Who invented, somebody's asking, who invented provisionism? Well, the Bible. Of course, the Bible. No, the term provisionism is something I coined, but it really is just God provides. Yeah, and it's just a word that's become an ism because it's centered around the provision of God. It's based upon book I wrote, God Provides for All, and it's been coined as provisionism, which is just, yeah, we're sinners, yeah, we're dead in sin, yes, all those things are true, but God provides for dead sinners, and He provides life-giving truth. So that's what provisionism is all about. Moving down here. Yeah, let me remind you, as somebody else is reminding here, Jamie, thank you. There's 80 people right now watching and only 30 thumbs up so far. So, hey, it does help us. Give us a thumbs up. And it helps us if you subscribe, and it helps us if you share and click on that bell. I do appreciate that. That really does help in the placement of the videos with when people are searching for certain terms. It really does help. Let's see. Arthur is saying, when people try to speak about God's hardening someone, I ask them to explain hardening. Hardening was a common knowledge to Moses and to those who received the written story of the same. Yeah, that's sometimes it feels like you got to kind of do a base level education on self-hardening versus judicial hardening. Self-hardening being what you do by your own free will when you continue to act in sin versus repenting of your sin so as to be cleansed. One who repents in faith begins to become cleansed and sanctified. One who refuses to repent and continues to act in sin will become hardened and calloused, and God will not contend with them forever. And He can judicially, and act as the judge, blind them or give them over to their hardened condition, or strengthen them in their already hardened resolve so as to accomplish a good purpose through even their rebellion. And so sometimes you got to give that explanation to people to help them understand it. Whereas, as author is rightly noting here, most of the first century Jews would have already known this. This would have been common knowledge to them. So they would have understood Romans 9 in the quote unquote correct way, the provisionistic way versus the Calvinistic way, which is why very likely you don't have Calvinistic interpretation showing up until hundreds of years later by people who don't know Greek. And again, those are just facts of the matter, not trying to be polemic, just facts. Is William Lane Craig a Calvinist? No, he is. He calls himself an Arminian, classical, kind of more of a classical Arminian perspective. And he set in a couple of my sessions at our conference, which I got really nervous. Mike Licona, who is another leading apologist, those that don't know Mike should. Dr. Licona is a very, very astute scholar. In fact, Mike Licona right there wrote an endorsement for this book, so I appreciate that. But William Lane Craig and Mike Licona walked into one of my breakout sessions in my conferences and sat in and listened. And I was, of course, humbled by that. And then later during a question and answer time, William Lane Craig is asked a question, and then he references me. He actually quotes from my session earlier to answer the question. And that was like a birthday present. That wasn't on my birthday. It was really a cool thing, because I've always looked up to Dr. Craig because of his scholarship for many years. I don't agree with everything he's ever taught or said, but he is a scholar among scholars for sure. And by the way, there's a lot of stuff online about some of Craig's positions on certain matters, and you've got to remember that when you're an apologist, oftentimes you're defending defeaters with regard to accusations against Christianity, and sometimes that means entertaining various perspectives, some of which may be labeled liberal in your worldview or your context, but that aren't necessarily so in the academic context. So be gracious with people when they're explaining things from more of an academic perspective versus, a theological one. Just saying. I'm laughing at some of the comments. Yes, love is to share. Share, please share. All right. I think we're getting to the end of our questions on the side chat, but I'd gotten some complaints recently that I wasn't taking time to engage in some of the questions and comments. So I'm trying to do that more diligently, especially whenever I have things going on. Oh, wait, there's Jenna. I'm sorry. I missed yours. Are you at all worried that Calvinism will not die out as it usually does and will keep getting bigger and bigger? We know history repeats itself. And so, I mean, I tend to think it's going to repeat itself in this situation as well. There's always a correction that tends to take place. So I still am under the same impression that just like it's surged up and died back out before, it will do the same again. It's going to take the Christian world, generally speaking, Christendom, to catch up with Calvinism online. Because like I said, Calvinism's surge hit right at the precipice of the internet boom of the mid 90s, early 2000s. All that converged, and because Calvinists are so prolific about their Calvinism, it's like it's a 10-to-1 ratio of Calvinistic resources versus non-Calvinistic resources. And so it feels like if you're a student of the Word right now, because everybody goes to Google and YouTube for their answers now. Very few people go to a library for their answers. If you went to a library, you would still get a pretty good balance of both perspectives, unless you're at a Calvinistic seminary, probably, maybe not so much. But if you went to a normal theological seminary or something like that, you would probably get resources that were pretty balanced with regard to those things. But if you go online and you search these things, like I said, it's a 10-to-1. And not only is it 10-to-1, because of the way the search features work in YouTube and in Google, is that the more clicks a particular site gets, then the more popular it becomes on the search features. And therefore, people don't usually scroll to page 2 or 3 of Google before they'll start clicking on links. So you've got, for example, Jack Cottrell's view of Romans chapter 9. Most of you have no idea who Jack Cottrell even is. Yeah. First time you've ever heard his name is probably today. Many of you, right? But every one of you knows who RC Sproul is, or John Piper is. And so it's popularity oftentimes will judge where those things land. And so it's not until the internet catches up from the non-Calvinistic vantage point when more and more people begin to publish resources. Well, and I give you an example. Wayne Grudem is probably right now the leading systematic theologian out there with his big systematic theology that's almost exclusively the required systematic in almost every Southern Baptist and probably even Bible seminary out there. It's just even the seminary where I teach, Trinity, requires Grudem's stuff because it's so widespread. Well, it was because of this that Adam Harwood, Dr. Harwood from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, decided to write a systematic because we needed a modern systematic that would be there as an alternative for people to look at. And that's where it's almost like in the print form of the systematics, at least, it's like the non-Calvinists are trying to catch up with the Calvinists' writings and producing the materials. And it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time before it gets out there. The success of this program, whatever it is, it's not the most successful program by any means. It's a drop in the bucket compared to any of the leading Calvinistic websites out there. It's like a little drop in the ocean compared to Calvinism. But whatever success this particular show has had is a demonstration of my point, is that the reason that people are coming here to find this information is that there's very few people who are putting out broadcasts and information to contend with the swath of all the behemoth, huge Calvinistic, highly funded sources that are out there. And that's why we're just a drop in the bucket in comparison to the many others. But it's just a matter of time before people will begin to study these things and see why Calvinism's died out before, why scholars begin to. And what's really interesting about this, even within Presbyterianism, I just found this out recently, or talking to somebody about this recently, who has worked in and is part of the Presbyterian churches, that actually among Presbyterians, many of the leading Presbyterians and most Presbyterian congregations have become much, much less Calvinistic. And actually, it's interesting because he was talking about in his context, in the particular area he is, that his Presbyterian church in the area is less Calvinistic than the Southern Baptist church down the corner, who is led by a 5-point Calvinist. And so what the irony of all ironies is that the Southern Baptist church, the Baptist church, is more Calvinistic than the Presbyterian church in his context. And he said that's actually pretty normal right now, because Presbyterians actually have lessened their Calvinism as a whole, because, again, Calvinism is just not tenable. It's just, in my estimation, it's not a workable, livable way of life, and it's very unbecoming. It makes Christianity seem really, really bad. And so a lot of Calvinists see that. They see it doesn't practically work. They see it's untenable. And a lot of them start burying it until the point where the next generation just doesn't teach it at all, because they recognize of how untenable and unpractical the systematic is. And many of them begin to slowly but surely, it kind of peters out, so to speak, within the next generations, because it's not a very workable way of life. At least that's my estimation of it. Yeah, and it ends up eating itself, is what one person's saying there. And that's what Phil Johnson even predicts will happen, is that it's happened before again and again, is that Calvinism becomes more and more staunch, more and more consistent with itself, and eventually it's eaten up by its own. And hyper-Calvinism, as Phil Johnson calls it, will eventually kill the Calvinistic resurgence. And I agree with him on that, his prediction. Yeah, and arguing does seem fruitless at times. I hear you, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, truth is that I was having a lot of discussions with people, even coming out of my Calvinism, one-on-one, just with people online, much like you guys probably do whenever you engage with Calvinists online, and it does feel fruitless, which is one of the reasons I started the podcast. Is that at least this is a way to answer a lot of people at one time, and to get material out there for people to be able to use and pass on to other people. And so for those of you who are gifted writers, write. If you're gifted in some way to produce videos, for example, produce videos. I mean, think about how many Calvinistic videos have been produced that are out there. If you've got a gift to do something like that, then use your creativity and your abilities and produce some videos. You don't have to do, I mean, just do it on the side. Don't have to change your livelihood or anything else. It's like I'm doing this in my spare time. You're in your spare time, produce some stuff, write some stuff, put it out there for the church and the world to see, and promote what God's been teaching you about his provision for all people. Use your gifts to impact others instead of maybe just debating online with random Calvinists to get yourself all riled up with debates. And use your gifts for a bigger purpose and a greater purpose if you can. Of Mice and Men says, I used to produce 4 videos with 112 views. Hey, back when I first produced my first 4 videos, they probably had about the same. So hang in there and keep going at it. You've got, that's 112 more people who know what you're learning and what you're teaching. So that's the way it all starts. You just little by little. Quite honestly, when I started the podcast, I thought maybe about 112 people might listen in total. That's just life. That's the way it works. Everything starts small. Yeah, yeah, you're right. Jen is pointing out, says, well, maybe it'll lead its own, or maybe they'll just keep adding letters to tulip in order to keep it alive, which is what Piper's kind of done. I mean, Piper is known as a 7-point Calvinist. And so, yeah, men like Piper have done a lot to help further Calvinistic think and the way Calvinists think. And Piper is probably one of the most prolific writers and propagators of the systematic of Calvinism. And, I think of the leading voices in that. I think of Piper. I think of Sproul, who just recently passed on, MacArthur, who is beyond retirement age. I think maybe he's already in that stage where he is actually letting go of some positions because of his age. I'm thinking of, then you got people like the next generation of Calvinists would be what, like De Young, possibly. Vodi Bakum is younger, but he's probably in between those two. But Chandler, who's my age, but Chandler didn't hardly ever talk about it. Even De Young will talk about it when he's at a conference for it. But the stuff I've listened to him preach or talk about, he doesn't really do it like Piper does it. And so even among the younger guys, it seems like more and more they're kind of talking about it less and less. And so the more it'll become kind of normal not to discuss it, I think you'll begin to see kind of start to peter out. All right, I'm going to bring that to an end. And once again, as I end, I want to remind you, go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.